Iran's military planners have spent the past year preparing for threats coming from the sea, from the skies, and from across its western border with Iraq. What they were not fully prepared for, according to a growing number of regional reports now surfacing from northern Iraq and Iranian Kurdistan, is a threat rising from inside their own mountains. Kurdish armed factions operating along the Iran-Iraq border have reportedly launched a coordinated series of operations against Iranian military and IRGC positions over the past several weeks. And unlike the sporadic border skirmishes Tehran has managed for decades, intelligence sources describe this new wave as something categorically different in scale, coordination, and intent. For a regime already stretched thin, managing economic collapse, internal unrest, and a badly damaged proxy network across the region, the reported opening of a genuine second front along its northwestern frontier could not have come at a more dangerous moment. Before you understand exactly how serious this development actually is, you need to understand who these Kurdish fighters are, why they've chosen this exact moment to strike, and why Tehran's response so far suggests a regime far more anxious about this front than its public statements are letting on. Let's start with what has actually been reported on the ground. Over the past several weeks, Kurdish opposition groups based in the mountainous border regions of Iranian Kurdistan, an area that has hosted armed Kurdish resistance movements against Tehran in various forms since the earliest days of the Islamic Republic, have reportedly carried out a series of coordinated ambushes and strikes against IRGC checkpoints, logistics convoys, and at least one reported strike against a district security headquarters near the border town of Piranshar. What makes these operations different from the kind of low-level skirmishing that has occurred periodically for years is the reported coordination between multiple Kurdish factions that have historically operated independently, and in some cases with significant political rivalry between them, now apparently conducting operations along a shared timeline and, according to some reports, sharing intelligence and logistics support across factional lines for the first time in over a decade. This matters enormously, because Kurdish political fragmentation has traditionally been one of Tehran's most reliable tools for managing the threat these groups represent. As long as rival Kurdish parties remain divided by old ideological and territorial disputes, Iranian security forces could exploit those divisions, playing factions against each other, targeting the weaker groups first, and preventing anything resembling a unified Kurdish resistance front from ever fully forming. According to regional analysts who track Kurdish political movements closely, what's happened over the past several weeks looks like exactly the kind of unification Tehran has spent decades trying to prevent. The timing is being read by several of these analysts as no coincidence at all. So why now? This is where the story connects to everything happening elsewhere across the region simultaneously. Iran's proxy network, the collection of allied militias and armed groups Tehran has relied on for decades to project power without direct confrontation, has suffered catastrophic losses over the past 2 years. Hezbollah's command structure in Lebanon has been severely degraded. Hamas's military capacity in Gaza has been reduced to fragments of what it once was. The Assad government in Syria, long a critical land bridge for Iranian influence and weapons transfers, collapsed entirely, removing one of Tehran's most important strategic assets in the region almost overnight. Each of these losses individually would represent a serious blow to Iranian regional strategy. Together, they represent something close to the total unraveling of the deterrence architecture Iran spent 40 years building. And according to several Kurdish political analysts, this is precisely the opening Kurdish opposition movements have been waiting for. Kurdish resistance movements against Tehran have existed in various organized forms since 1979, but for most of that history, they operated under a brutal strategic reality. Any sustained campaign against IRGC forces risked drawing overwhelming retaliation at a moment when Tehran's security apparatus remained fully intact and capable of devoting significant resources to border security without any competing distractions. That calculation has reportedly shifted dramatically. With Iran's attention, resources, and military bandwidth increasingly consumed by economic crisis management, internal security concerns within its own ranks, and the aftermath of its regional proxy network's collapse, Kurdish factions appear to have identified a genuine window of opportunity, a moment when Tehran simply does not have the same depth of resources to respond to a coordinated border insurgency the way it might have 5 years ago. Now, I want to show you something that captures the human reality behind these reported operations far better than any strategic analysis can. This is footage that circulated briefly through Kurdish diaspora social media channels before being taken down, reportedly showing residents of a border village describing the aftermath of what they say was an IRGC search operation following one of the recent ambushes. A woman speaking in Kurdish, translated by diaspora activists, describes soldiers going house to house and says something that should stop you. They cannot find the fighters in the mountains, so they come to punish us instead. This is a claim that cannot be independently verified through this single clip. But it reflects a pattern that has defined the Iran-Kurdistan conflict for decades, a counterinsurgency strategy that has historically relied heavily on collective punishment of border communities, a strategy that Kurdish rights organizations have long argued only deepens the very resentment fueling continued resistance in the first place. Let's look at the actual military geography here, because it explains exactly why this front is so uniquely dangerous for Tehran. The Iran-Iraq border region running through Iranian Kurdistan is defined by extraordinarily difficult mountainous terrain, dense forest cover in parts, and a network of remote valleys that have historically made large-scale conventional military operations against guerrilla forces enormously costly and slow. This is precisely the terrain that allowed Kurdish resistance movements to survive decades of periodic IRGC offensives without ever being fully eliminated. And it's the same terrain that turned neighboring Iraqi Kurdistan into a functionally autonomous region, despite Baghdad's formal sovereignty over it for years. Iranian ground forces attempting to conduct sustained operations in this terrain face the same brutal calculus that has frustrated counterinsurgency campaigns throughout history. Overwhelming firepower, advantages mean very little against an enemy that knows the terrain intimately, moves in small dispersed units, and can melt back across the porous Iraqi border whenever pressure becomes too intense on the Iranian side. This border geography is where the two-front war framing genuinely starts to make sense, and it's worth being precise about what that means. Iran's Western military posture has, for years, been organized primarily around two very different kinds of threats: the conventional deterrence relationship with the United States and Gulf states across the Persian Gulf to the south, requiring naval assets, air defense networks, and missile forces concentrated along the coast, and a separate, much smaller counterinsurgency and border security apparatus historically sufficient to manage sporadic Kurdish resistance activity in the north. What regional intelligence services are reportedly now observing is a scenario where Tehran can no longer treat these as separate, manageable problems, because a genuinely coordinated and intensified Kurdish insurgency campaign in the north would require redirecting IRGC ground forces, helicopters, and internal security resources away from the broader regional posture Iran has maintained against Israeli and American pressure, creating exactly the kind of resource allocation dilemma military planners spend careers trying to avoid. Let's zoom out further, because the reported strikes near Pir and Shar are only part of a broader pattern analysts have been tracking. Multiple reports over the past month describe increased activity not just from Kurdish factions, but from a wider coalition of ethnic minority opposition movements along Iran's periphery, each operating independently but reportedly emboldened by the same underlying calculation: that Tehran's capacity to respond forcefully on every front simultaneously has been meaningfully degraded. Baloch separatist groups operating in Iran's southeastern Sistan and Baluchistan province have reportedly carried out their own increased attacks against IRGC border posts in recent weeks. A geographically distant front, but one that further strains the same overstretched IRGC ground forces and internal security apparatus. Azeri nationalist sentiment in Iran's northwest, while not manifesting in armed conflict, has reportedly seen increased political agitation that Iranian security services are having to monitor alongside everything else. None of these movements are coordinated with each other in any formal sense according to the analysts tracking them, but their simultaneous intensification creates a cumulative pressure on Iranian security resources that functions almost the same as coordination would, simply by forcing Tehran to disperse its already strained capabilities across multiple fronts at once, rather than concentrating overwhelming force against any single one. This is where the story becomes genuinely significant for the wider region, because every major power watching Iran right now has to recalculate its own posture based on a Tehran that may be facing meaningfully reduced internal security bandwidth. Let's start with Iraq's Kurdistan regional government, whose position here is exceptionally delicate. Erbil has historically tried to maintain a careful balancing act, hosting Iranian Kurdish opposition groups within its territory under loose tolerance, while simultaneously trying to avoid provoking direct Iranian retaliation against Iraqi Kurdistan itself, retaliation that has occurred before, including previous Iranian missile and drone strikes against Kurdish opposition targets inside Iraqi territory. According to regional sources, Kurdistan regional government officials are reportedly nervous that an intensified insurgency campaign originating from groups operating near or across the Iraqi border could provoke exactly this kind of retaliatory strike again, dragging Iraqi Kurdistan into a confrontation it did not choose and cannot easily control, given the limited authority Erbil has ever actually exercised over independent Iranian Kurdish factions operating on its soil. Baghdad's federal government faces its own uncomfortable position. Iraq's central government has spent years trying to balance a complicated relationship with Tehran, whose influence over Iraqi Shia militia networks remains substantial, against its own sovereignty concerns whenever Iranian forces conduct cross-border strikes into Iraqi Kurdistan without Baghdad's meaningful consent. An intensified Kurdish insurgency campaign against Iran, operating partly from Iraqi soil, risks putting Baghdad in an impossible diplomatic position, caught between Iranian pressure to crack down on Kurdish opposition groups within Iraqi territory and the Kurdistan regional government's own reluctance and arguably limited practical capacity to do so. Turkey's position adds yet another layer of complexity, given Ankar's own decades-long conflict with Kurdish militant groups along its own borders. Turkish officials have historically approached any strengthening of Kurdish political or military organization anywhere in the region with deep suspicion, wary of momentum that could eventually strengthen Kurdish nationalist movements more broadly, including groups Turkey considers direct threats to its own territorial security. According to some regional analysts, this creates a genuinely strange dynamic where Ankara, despite having no love for the Iranian regime, may actually share Tehran's interest in seeing this Kurdish insurgency contained and suppressed purely out of concern for the precedent. A successful, coordinated, multifactional Kurdish campaign against a major regional power could set for Kurdish movements elsewhere, including within Turkey's own borders. Israel's calculation here is entirely different and reportedly far more opportunistic. Israeli intelligence services have a long, well-documented history of covert engagement with Kurdish opposition movements as a tool for applying pressure on hostile regional governments, a strategy dating back decades to earlier periods of Israeli-Kurdish cooperation against Iraqi and Iranian targets. Several regional security analysts believe Israeli intelligence has likely increased its own engagement with Iranian Kurdish opposition networks amid the current unrest, viewing a genuine second front along Iran's northwestern border as directly serving Israeli strategic interests by further straining Iranian military and security resources, at a moment when Israel's broader campaign against Iranian proxy networks has already left Tehran significantly weakened. Whether this translates into direct material support remains unconfirmed and is treated with appropriate skepticism by most serious analysts, but the strategic logic for Israeli interest in this development is difficult to dispute. The United States, meanwhile, is reportedly watching this development with a mixture of interest and caution. American officials have historically maintained a complicated arm's-length relationship with various Kurdish factions across the region, providing support to Iraqi and Syrian Kurdish groups in counter-ISIS operations, while remaining notably more cautious about direct engagement with Iranian Kurdish opposition movements specifically, wary of provoking direct Iranian retaliation against American forces still stationed in Iraq and Syria. Defense officials speaking anonymously reportedly describe internal discussions about whether increased instability along Iran's Kurdish border represents a strategic opportunity worth quiet engagement or an unpredictable variable that could complicate an already volatile regional picture in ways difficult to fully control once set in motion. Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, watching from a very different vantage point, reportedly see this development primarily through the lens of Iranian regional weakness more broadly. A Tehran forced to fight simultaneously on multiple internal fronts, managing a collapsing proxy network, economic crisis, internal military distrust, and now an intensifying multi-ethnic border insurgency, is a Tehran with dramatically reduced capacity to project the kind of regional pressure that has shaped Gulf security calculations for decades. Some Gulf officials reportedly view this as validating their recent cautious diplomatic normalization with Iran, betting that a weakened, internally distracted Tehran represents a less dangerous long-term neighbor than the more assertive, proxy-empowered Iran of years past. Others within Gulf security establishments reportedly worry about the opposite outcome, that a regime feeling genuinely cornered on this many fronts simultaneously could become significantly more unpredictable rather than less, exactly the concern that has shaped Gulf strategic thinking throughout previous periods of Iranian internal stress. Russia's position is shaped almost entirely by its dependence on continued Iranian drone and missile supplies for its war effort in Ukraine, a relationship any serious disruption to Iran's internal stability directly threatens. Moscow has reportedly expressed private concern through diplomatic channels about the security of supply lines and production facilities that could theoretically become vulnerable if Iranian internal security resources become further strained managing multiple simultaneous insurgency fronts, according to sources familiar with Russian-Iranian military coordination discussions. Russian state media, consistent with its broader pattern regarding negative Iranian news, has largely avoided substantive coverage of the reported Kurdish operations, a silence regional media analysts interpret as a deliberate choice to avoid drawing additional attention to instability affecting a critical wartime supplier. China's interest, as with previous developments inside Iran, centers almost entirely on oil supply stability rather than any ideological stake in the outcome. Beijing's primary concern reportedly involves whether an intensifying multi-front security crisis inside Iran could eventually disrupt the export infrastructure and shipping routes Chinese refineries depend on for discounted Iranian crude, a concern that has reportedly already prompted some diversification of Chinese crude sourcing toward other regional suppliers, as a hedge against exactly this kind of scenario. So how seriously should any of this actually be taken? This is where genuine skepticism becomes essential, because Kurdish resistance activity against Tehran has ebbed and flowed in cycles for over 4 decades, without ever fundamentally threatening the regime's control over its territory. A senior fellow at a regional security think tank who has studied Iranian Kurdish opposition movements for over 15 years offered an important counterpoint to the more dramatic framing of these developments. Coordinated periods of increased Kurdish activity have occurred before, particularly during previous moments of broader Iranian regional weakness. And each time, Tehran ultimately proved capable of containing the threat through a combination of overwhelming force, cross-border strikes into Iraqi territory targeting opposition camps directly, and its long-standing strategy of exploiting factional divisions between rival Kurdish groups, once the initial moment of coordination faded. This analyst pointed out that IRGC ground forces, whatever resource strain they may currently be experiencing elsewhere, still possess vastly superior firepower, air support, and logistics compared to any Kurdish opposition faction. And that, historically, tactical ambushes and border skirmishes, however embarrassing for Tehran in the moment, have rarely translated into any meaningful long-term territorial or political gains for Kurdish resistance movements against the Islamic Republic. The same analyst raised a further point worth taking seriously. Much of the reporting on factional Kurdish unification circulating in recent weeks originates from Kurdish diaspora media and opposition-aligned sources, which, much like exile-run Iranian opposition networks more broadly, carry an inherent incentive to portray any signs of unified resistance in the most significant possible light. This doesn't necessarily mean the reports of increased coordination are false, but it does mean the scale and durability of this apparent unification should be treated with appropriate caution until confirmed through more independent sources, particularly given the deep, decades-old rivalries between major Kurdish political factions that have derailed previous unification efforts before. This is the genuine tension running through this entire story, and it deserves to be held honestly rather than resolved prematurely in either direction. On one hand, the reported operations near Piran-Shar, the apparent cross-factional coordination, and the simultaneous intensification of Balakh and other minority unrest along Iran's periphery represent a genuinely unusual convergence of pressure on an Iranian security apparatus already stretched thin by economic crisis and internal distrust within the IRGC's own ranks. On the other hand, Tehran has weathered periodic waves of Kurdish and minority unrest for over 4 decades, without any of them fundamentally threatening the regime's territorial control, and analysts who have watched previous cycles of heightened Kurdish activity fade without lasting consequence have learned to treat each new wave with measured caution, rather than assuming this time is categorically different. What may genuinely be different this time, according to the analysts most closely tracking the broader picture, is not the Kurdish insurgency itself in isolation, but the sheer number of simultaneous pressures converging on Tehran's security apparatus at once. A regime managing internal distrust of its own military, a devastated proxy network, a collapsing economy, and now a reportedly more unified and intensified insurgency campaign along its northwestern border, layered against a backdrop of separate unrest in its southeast and northwest, faces a fundamentally different resource allocation challenge than it has in previous decades, when it could typically address one serious internal or border security threat at a time while managing the others through lower intensity, sustainable containment measures. Let's go back to that woman's voice from the clip we opened with, describing search operations sweeping through her border village. Whatever the ultimate military outcome of this reported insurgency campaign, whatever Tehran's leadership decides about how forcefully to respond, the pattern she describes, and the pattern Kurdish communities along this border have described for over 4 decades, is one where local civilian populations bear the heaviest cost of a conflict shaped by decisions made far away in Tehran and in mountain command posts equally distant from their daily lives. That reality has not changed regardless of how this particular chapter of the conflict unfolds. And it's worth remembering that behind every strategic calculation described by intelligence officials and regional analysts, there are entire border communities living with the immediate, unglamorous consequences of a war they did not start and cannot easily escape. Whether this reported second front ultimately forces Tehran into a genuine multi-theater security crisis, or eventually fades the way previous waves of Kurdish resistance activity have faded after Tehran regains enough capacity to concentrate force against it, one thing seems clear from everything currently being reported across the region. Iran's period of being able to treat its border security challenges as isolated, manageable problems, handled one at a time, appears to be ending, replaced by a far more complicated reality where every front, from the Persian Gulf to the Kurdish mountains to the Balakh southeast, now competes for the same shrinking pool of resources, attention, and loyalty that Tehran has relied on for over 4 decades to hold its vast and diverse territory together. If this pattern of simultaneous pressure continues intensifying rather than fading, the question facing Iran's leadership in the months ahead may not simply be how to defeat any single threat, but how to decide which fronts to defend and which to temporarily concede, a kind of strategic triage the Islamic Republic has never seriously had to contemplate before, and one that, according to the analysts watching this unfold most closely, could ultimately reveal far more about the regime's true remaining strength than any single battle along any single border ever could. If you want to keep following exactly how this second front develops along Iran's western border, make sure you subscribe, because this is a rapidly evolving story, and we will be tracking every new development the moment it surfaces.